Hello and welcome to another episode of Secondhand Horror, a show where we find interesting, unique horror books and read them to you like you're 5 years old. We are continuing our series on 1985's Totentanz, about a spooky carnival that shows up in a town. We haven't gotten back to our main protagonist yet, and I'm curious if we will find him this week. The last couple of weeks we've had some very long chapters, so we're going to go back to doing 2 at a time. Today we're doing chapters 13 and 14. I'm super excited to see where this goes. Let's begin. Chapter 13. Plain as day, Mayor Poundridge had seen his dead father waiting for him just inside the gates to the new amusement park. Plain as day, he'd seen that bemused, tolerant look, the look that said, "You're my son, and you'll do all right." And the ache of recognition and remembered loss had grown so strong that all other thoughts had disappeared. Despite the impossibility, not an atom of doubt had been in his mind. It was his father. He was alive again, period. Only joy and reunion could follow. But where was his father now? And where was Emily? Emily had been right behind him as they rushed up to the gates. When he saw the swell of people begin to gather there, he felt it was the duty to be the first through, to say something to them, to make the occasion official. Heck, it was his privilege. Some were in their nightclothes, but most wore light summer shirts or blouses and pants. Most looked expectant, but some looked downright joyful, like that Reggie Carson's mother. She was staring at the sky, and Poundridge had looked up just in time to catch the sight of a plane, long and sleek, before it was lost in the glare of the lights. Hadn't her husband died in a plane crash? There was a great swell of anticipation. Emily had been beside him then, he knew, because she had clutched his arm and pointed to a short woman beyond the entrance who looked like her departed Aunt Lucy. At that point, Poundridge felt he had to speak, and he pushed his way to the closed gates, Emily following. "Friends," he shouted, and for a moment they ignored him, too caught up in their own emotions to pay attention. But he knew crowds. There were too many politicians' genes in him for something like this to stand in his way, and when Emily put her hand on his arm, he tried again. "Friends, please!" This time, a few heads turned. "This is a great occasion in our town's history, and I just wanted you to know that I am here to represent." Then the gate swung open, and his words disappeared in the surge forward. He was just able to push to the front as the great mass followed into the park. He was sure Emily had still been with him at that point. He had felt her hand on his arm as they went through, had even patted it. But then he'd seen something that annoyed him. He had thought that he was the first to enter the park, but somehow that scamp pup, Malamut, had found his way in before him. There he was, standing next to a stall that said, "Guess your weight," in fresh red letters. He was smiling with his arms folded. The nerve of that boy! Everything else was pushed from his mind at that moment, and when Pup turned and began to swagger away down one of the causeways, Poundridge stalked after him. It was then that he discovered he had somehow been separated from Emily. He tried to catch sight of her closely bunned hair in the crowd, but she was nowhere in sight. Which is strange because she was always there, like a hand or a foot, always where she was supposed to be. What had she been wearing? He couldn't remember. A blue dress? Brown? He didn't even know if she owned a brown dress. He hadn't really looked at her in years. She had just always been there. When he needed something, there Emily was, with a file from the office or his pipe, which he was always mislaying. He found it hard now to remember what she looked like. It had been so long since he had really looked at her. To live with someone so long and yet forget what she looked like. Pup Malamute was disappearing around the corner. Mayor Poundridge hesitated a moment, then turned to go after the boy. Emily was important, but this was more important. The youngster had smirked at him, as though he knew the mayor had lost face and he was gloating over it. That wouldn't do. Pup Malamute's father had caused trouble for Mayor Poundridge, had challenged him a few times in council meetings, and had even considered running against him once. They were a high and mighty bunch, that Malamute family, and there was no reason why the mayor should put up with it any longer. He'd teach old Malamute a lesson this time. They thought money could buy everything, and well, it couldn't. Not everything. He'd catch that boy by the scruff of his neck, and when he got to the corner, the boy had vanished. A long line of shooting galleries and other games of chance lay before the mayor. There were a few people milling about, but Pup Malamute was not among them. The mayor thought of asking anyone if they'd seen the boy, but that would only call attention to the fact that Pup had upstaged him. He was about to turn away to go back and find Emily, when he caught the sight of the boy leaning over the counter of the last game tent, pitching softballs into an angled barrel. He finished the game and turned away, but not before giving the mayor that insolent look again. Infuriated, Poundridge followed. "Damn boy," he thought. He instantly rebuked himself for thinking a curse word, but the sentiment would not leave him. He reached the game tent where Pup had been and stopped to regain his breath. He looked and saw that all 3 softballs were neatly nestled in the wooden barrel. For the oddest moment, as Mayor Poundridge looked at the barrel with those 3 large balls in it, it became a face, and the 3 balls merged into 2 enormous eyes. An animal face of some sort stared at him, but like Marley's face on Scrooge's door knocker, the vision passed. His mind still bent on catching the boy, Poundridge moved on. He turned into another causeway, this more isolated than the other. The lights were not quite so bright, and there were dark patches of shadow. It was, in fact, a rear alley of sorts, the backs of tents lined either side, and occasionally there was a thump as mist-aimed balls or thudding darts struck against the canvases. It was very dark ahead of the mayor, as if all the brightness had suddenly bled out and night had fallen in. Pup was nowhere to be seen. Poundridge's anger began to subside, replaced by a hint of anxiety. Maybe it wasn't Pup he had seen after all. Maybe that hadn't been Pup pitching softballs. He advanced a step at a time. As he passed the space between 2 tents, there came a sound. He jumped and then saw a softball rolling toward him. Vaguely, he heard voices and the distant murky tinkle of the calliope. The ball rolled to a stop at his foot, just inside a small pool of dim light. Poundridge looked down at it. There was a face on it, the face he had seen in the barrel with the 3 balls in it, large and round, the face of a lion or a hare with monstrous eyes. The eyes stared up at him, becoming bigger and bigger until they filled the whole face. Then the face vaporized, and Poundridge kicked the ball into the shadows ahead. The lights had gone out. He was standing under the only light to be seen. There was a glow of luminosity to his right from between the 2 tents, but as he watched, it faded. Above him there was a single dim bulb taped to a tall pole, along with a speaker horn. The calliope's music, he heard, was coming tinnily from the horn. Someone lit a match very close in front of him. As quickly as it flared, it went out. "You'd like to go back?" a disembodied voice said. Poundridge turned to flee. Immediately he collided with something solid in the dark, banging his face and shoulder against it. He staggered back, holding his bleeding nose. The voice behind him laughed, and he reached out to see what he had hit. It was a solid wooden beam connected to wooden struts. He could not see it, but he traced the outline of the structure with his hands, frantically trying to feel his way around it. The laugh, low and coarse, came again. He found a step at the far right of the structure. Since there was no way to get beyond that, he felt upward another step, and then another, until his hand chanced upon something not made of wood. A leg, as cold as ice, with a smooth shoe on the foot. He pulled back with a start. "What's happening here?" he called out in a tremulous voice. His fear did not allow him to project the authority he wanted. The bulb overhead brightened, the filament inside glowing hotter and hotter, as though turned up by a dimmer switch. Now light filled the entire space in front of him, revealing the sharp outline of timbers and struts leading up toward the dark. Poundridge looked up at the figure attached to the leg he had felt on the stairway. "Hello, son," the figure said. "Father?" Poundridge gazed into the face of his father. He blinked fiercely, not believing his eyes. So it was true. Momentary joy welled up within him, but instantly it was gone. When he had seen his father through the gates of the amusement park, it had seemed right. It was impossible, but it had all been right. Now, he knew it wasn't right, that something was horribly not right. A certain feeling came over him, like a curtain had been lifted from his mind, and what had seemed before a joyful reunion was now, in cold, clear logic, a terrible event. On the step above the one on which his father stood was another figure. It resembled his father, but was a bit stouter. On the step above that was another figure, and another up into the darkness. Mayor Poundridge stood staring into a dim, silent line of faces, each like his own, each fuller and fatter than the one below. "I'm losing my mind," he muttered, trying to blink away the phantoms before him. "No," said that cold, disembodied, slightly amused voice behind him. Jonathan Poundridge whirled around but saw nothing except darkness. Turning back, he fully expected the silent line of clones to be gone, but it was not. Poundridge's father said, "This is my father behind me, and his father behind him. All your ancestors stand before you, Jonathan." "You're all dead," the mayor said to them, still hoping they might vanish like smoke, drift away like ghosts along the darkness and the wooden structure. He hoped that he would find himself back at the entrance to the amusement park, bidding all of Montvale to have a good time, and Emily by his side. "Emily," he said, feeling very alone without her. From higher up on the wooden structure, above the cone of light, someone snickered. Another bright bulb flashed on, and Poundridge saw who it was. "You." Pup Malamut grinned down at him, an odd, triumphant smile on his face, his t-shirt askew, half pulled out of his pants. "Yes," Pup said. "Mad at me, aren't you?" Poundridge's anger returned, but it melted like butter at the sound of the other voice, the voice in the darkness. "Go ahead," the voice laughed. Pup Malamut clattered down the wooden steps, making them creak with his weight, and ran off, snickering into the night. Poundridge wanted to go after him, but found that he was unable to move. It occurred to him that this entire episode, this black and white scene, black of night with white light from the bulbs on the pole, looked exactly like one of those old television shows from the 1960s. Like a scene from Gunsmoke, or that strange show he had once watched with Emily, but never again, making Emily turn it off when he didn't understand it. The Outer Limits. "Get on with it," the voice behind him said. It sounded bored, yet tinged with anticipation. Jonathan Poundridge went limp in the knees. A terror gripped him by the back and paralyzed him. The curtain that had been drawn over his mind was yanked away, and he knew that something horrible was going to happen to him. This was no stunt, no amusement park ride or crazy dream he had wandered into. Something bad was going to happen to him, and there would be no Emily there to help him or tell him what to do. "Pup Malamut," he called desperately, "come back and help me. I promise nothing will happen to you. I won't even tell your father." His own father's dead face, dead voice seemed almost to be pleading with him now for understanding, for forgiveness. We must. The light beam traveled slowly up the steps to stop at a platform at the top. Poundridge looked up at the silent white faces of his ancestors. The voice behind him grew hard and commanding. Walk. Poundridge tried to resist, but could not. He began to whimper, his foot, in spite of his efforts to keep it where it was, moved forward a hesitating step, and then the other foot followed. He was on the first step with his father. Keep going, the voice commanded. His feet lifted, set down, lifted, set down. Step by step, he passed first his grandfather, a vague memory smelling of strong tobacco and old war stories. Then a succession of ghosts, each vaguer and fuller of body than the one before. It was as though something corporeal, something of the flesh, had been bled out of each succeeding generation of Poundridges, leaving his own lean body to answer to the ages. Each ancestor wore a different kind of clothing, and it was, as he passed, like watching the same man slowly gain weight and move through a succession of time shifts into the past. He was on the top step. His feet stopped. There was something before him on the platform that he did not want to see. The light ceased, sharp knife a few feet in front of him, and he felt out there in the darkness a presence that made his stomach turn over. "Emily!" he called, but he heard the word as it had left his mouth swallowed, as if his face had been muffled by a pillow. He heard a slow tread on the steps, and knew it was the voice in the dark. "Oh God," he whispered. "Move," the voice said from directly behind him. He advanced, a reluctant puppet. He saw and then felt hands reach out of the darkness, hands and arms that seemed to come out of a solid wall of black. They took hold of him and propelled him forward at the same time. Something was quickly wrapped around his neck and pulled tight. Illumination blossomed all around him, making night into day again, revealing the platform and the tall, straight length of timber that rose behind him and elbowed over his head to hold the thick hemp rope that was knotted around his thin, sweating neck. A dark man stood there. "Ever hear of the sins of the fathers, Mr. Mayor?" the mouth in the white, sack-like face said. "Tell me, what's happening here?" Poundridge wept once again and tried desperately to put authority into his words, but failed. "Let's get on with it," the other said, ignoring him. A solid terror started in Mayor Poundridge's stomach and immediately reached to the ends of his body. "I'm going to die," he thought, amazed that he was even taking the time to think such things. "I really am." With further illogic, he thought, this is what men in war feel like. There had been only one other time when he had perceived anything like this. He had been watching a movie on television called Paths of Glory. Kirk Douglas was in it. He had tuned in because he thought it would be a good war picture, and he had always liked war pictures. But this was something different. Kirk Douglas was defending 3 French soldiers who had been accused of not following orders during World War I. They had been told to go over the top and had refused. They were to be court-martialed and shot. His uneasiness had begun when he realized that everyone in the men's regiment had disobeyed the orders, and that these 3 had been picked at random as examples. It was obvious that despite Kirk Douglas, they would be shot at the end of the movie. Poundridge had watched with mounting fascination and horror as the film zeroed in on the 3 soldiers and made them into real characters. They were just men. The order to go over the top had been insane, and they were just unlucky enough to get picked to take the punishment. Poundridge had wanted to turn off the movie but found that he couldn't. Inevitably, the men were led out to execution, and he saw them actually tremble as they realized that this would be it. They were going to die. The rifles of the firing squad would be aiming at their hearts and then pumping little slugs of lead into them in a minute. 5 minutes from now, 3 minutes from now, whenever, they would be dead. As the firing squad took aim after the blindfolds had been put into place, one of the men began to whimper, to cry, and Poundridge had suddenly leaped from the sofa and hit the off button on the television. He had stood there, shaken, for a few minutes, and then had gone to bed without watching the news or anything else. The next morning, Emily had mentioned to him that he hadn't touched the potato chips she'd put out for him the night before, or the soda. And was there something the matter with him? And now it was going to happen to him. Here he was with this thick rope tight against his neck, tighter than any collar he had ever worn, so tight he could feel individual gnarled strands against the flesh of his neck, could feel the tautness of the rope if he moved his head from side to side, and in a few moments, in 3 minutes or 5, the wooden plank beneath his feet would give way and there would be nothing for him to stand upon. Either his neck would break or he would gulp for air that wasn't there, and then he would die. He would be dead. Every cell in his body knew that. Every cell fought against it, but there was nothing any of them could do. In 5 minutes at most, he would no longer be here. He would be dead. Gone. "Oh God, please," he began to whimper. The man on the platform next to him, a fat, nameless copy of himself with averted eyes and trembling hands, put his fingers on the straight piece of wood that would release the trap door beneath Jonathan Poundridge. "Please, no," Poundridge whimpered, but the fat man would not look at him. "I've changed my mind, Ash," a quiet voice said from below. The fat man paused with his fingers on the lever. The light softened, a stark black and white of the scene. That was the way Paths of Glory had looked, shifted to a more natural shade of night. The clench in Poundridge's stomach, the rock-hard fist, loosened a fraction. For the slightest moment, Ash seemed to shrink down into his clothes. But this passed so quickly that Poundridge could not swear it happened. With slow, deliberate steps, Ash dismounted the gallows until he stood on the black tarmac at the bottom, facing Jeff Scott. Miraculously, Poundridge discovered he was able to move, and he leaned forward, the rope pulling taut at the back of his neck, to watch what was going on below. "You've changed your mind?" Ash asked calmly, but with a tinge of ominous slithering beneath. "Yes," Jeff Scott answered. "What do you think happens now?" Ash questioned. His words rose to a shrill shout. Jeff Scott flinched. "Do I walk away? Do you? What happens, you fool?" Jeff Scott answered, "You tell me, Ash." Then he said, "I think you're afraid of me." Ash's arms rose. For a moment they seemed as high as the top of the platform, 2 long, horrid spider legs as thin and taut as piano wire, with horrible claws at the tips. But then they were only long, thin arms again. "Do you think this is all for you?" Ash screamed. Jeff Scott fell to his knees. "Do you think this whole stinking world was created for your indulgence? I've watched you. From the very beginning, I've watched your introspection with amusement, trying to come to terms with yourself, trying to understand your hate, trying to figure out why you found yourself on this stinking earth again, a walking corpse with feelings and emotions." Ash mocked in a falsetto. "Oh Lord, why am I here? What is my mission? Why have I been brought back?" He raised a hand to strike. "You fool, haven't you figured out by this time that you're one of the walking dead? That's all you are. There isn't any hope for you, no reason for you to try to puzzle out your predicament. Right now, at this moment, as you walk and seemingly breathe and push at the world with your little hands and try to figure out the universe, you are dead." Ash raised his hand even higher and brought it down in a long, scythe-like arc. Jeff Scott screamed as half his face was torn away. In its place was a half-exposed skull with bits of muscle and tissue attached to it. He shrieked, throwing his hands up to his face. But though the pain diminished, the wound was still there, open and alive. "Look at me," Ash commanded, and Jeff Scott looked into his face. The white, pasty mask melted away into a silver disc, a pool of water or a liquid mirror, and Jeff Scott saw his own face as it was now, half living, half dead. He felt fire course down his body and saw the flesh and blood stripped away from one side. "Stop!" he screamed, but the pain would not cease. He was half bone and half flesh. "This is what you are," Ash spat, pointing contemptuously at the skeletal half. "This is what you have been for 120 years, since that gallows rope choked your breath away. A dead man." Ash stretched a talon-like hand toward the sky. "All of this is gone for you. All of this is dead to you. You can't touch or feel. You might as well be maggots and soil for all the difference it makes to you. You're a worm, a pile of filth." He pushed at Jeff Scott, pushed at the bones on his left side, and Jeff Scott felt the hand there, cold against the cold bone. He collapsed, and Ash's face hovered over him. "Your hate sealed you long ago," Ash said quietly. "Do you still think I fear you?" Jeff Scott looked into that non-face, into the eyes that were puddles of blue emptiness, at that red mouth, and said, "You're afraid of something." A crack appeared deep in the mask. There was fear in that blank emptiness, in those ice-blank eyes, and for a hushed tick of time, Jeff Scott saw Ash's face for the mask it really was. A hard, vicious playface held over something fathomless and cruelly sure, yet deathly frightened. Ash's blade-like lips parted, and he screamed into Jeff Scott's face. The cry climbed into an impossible pitch of rage. Jeff saw the face above the mouth contort, the outstretched, arching hand ready to fall upon him. A moment of infinity passed. "No," Ash said finally. "That's what you want." He rose, leaving Jeff Scott on the ground before him. "I won't give you that, but I will give you this." Ash turned to the gallows and made a curt motion to the man at the top. Poundridge, who had been watching the scene below with fascination, almost forgetting that he was a player in the drama, thinking with an unsubstantial spark of hope that possibly this was a form of entertainment after all, some part of the amusement park designed to give the customer a real thrill, something to remember for a long time, was abruptly pulled back to his situation. The rope was still around his neck. He stood on the gallows. The pleading in his defense that had gone on below had not worked in his favor. The fist in his stomach gripped harder. He knew that the moment was upon him, the reprieved past. He saw his chubby ancestors tremble, but ineluctable hands tighten on the lever to the trapdoor. And he cried out for pardon, to be let free, like James Cagney, he thought, insanely at the end of that picture, where they drag him to the electric chair, screaming and pleading. Panic seized him even more fiercely, and he began to wail, "Please don't do this! I haven't done anything! Please! Oh God, please!" The fat ancestor's hands trembled like leaves in the wind. Jeff Scott tried to raise himself, but failed. As he fell back against the cold ground, Poundridge became hysterical. He felt his bowels empty, and at that moment, the trapdoor pulled open. "The sins of the fathers," Ash said, his eyes growing bright. Jonathan Poundridge cried out as the earth was pulled away from him. He fell a long way past row on row of his own face, each growing thinner, each silently turned toward him. He watched the dissipation of a race of men, and then he heard rather than felt a loud snap, and everything in his body was on fire, including his shrieking voice, which he heard no more. Ooh. Now I will say, despite sometimes this author kind of catching me off guard and making me go blah 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 blah, he has a way with beautiful word poetry, I guess you could say, in a way of writing that is both a narration but beautifully poetic and brings in a lot of different writing themes about repetition, of explanation, of drawing out a very short moment to really make you feel what's happening for a character. So now that we've gotten a little bit of Ash and Jeff mixed in with modern characters, I'm curious if we're going to hear from our protagonist Reggie and his friends soon, because it has been such a long time, but fingers crossed, it seems we're bringing things back home from the past. So I guess it's time to continue with the next chapter. Chapter 14. "I don't want to go in," Jack said. There was a quality in his voice that promised it would take a lot of convincing to change his mind. Big black clouds rammed across the sky overhead, and the wind hissed like snakes through the trees. It felt more like October than July. Though the low white churchyard gates were swung open, they formed as much of a barrier in Jack's mind as if there had been solid rock before him. "We've got to," Reggie said. "This is where it wanted me to go." As he took a tentative step forward, an animal-like light came into his eyes, and when he said, "Come on, Jack," Jack knew he meant it. Jack had heard Reggie talk that way before, in that sudden, serious, non-kid voice that implied, "Don't be a jerk, just do it." Now there was an urgency in the tone that Jack had never heard before. It wasn't fear in Reggie's voice, but a thing much worse, a thing that made Jack even more frightened than he already was. Eagerness. "Now I'll finally know," Reggie said. "No more dreams. I'll finally know." He turned. "Don't worry, Jack." Jack offered a weak smile. Reggie entered the cemetery, passing the short line of trees that led to the upslope of green grass and gravestones. A neat black road wound like Alice in Wonderland Street, curving in an S up and away from them around the perfectly sculpted hills. "Wow," Reggie said, and Jack, his hands thrust into his pockets against the chill, whipping wind, couldn't help muttering the same word. In front of each headstone, each plaque, each featureless slab, they saw a neatly dug hole, 6 feet by 3 feet, with a clod of turned earth next to it. It was as if all the grave diggers in the world had convened at once to leave their mark. "I don't believe this," Jack said, putting his hands deeper into his pockets. Reggie was silent. There was a slightly crooked smile on his lips, as if he had grown older in that moment. "Now I'm sure," he said. "I didn't want to believe it, but now I do. Ever since that amusement park arrived, that shadow man, the eyes." As he talked, he began to walk up the hill, past the first of the open graves. Jack followed. "Can you smell it?" Reggie asked, stopping in front of a deep, dark hole and sniffing at the air. "Can you?" "No," Jack started to say, but then there it was, a sickly sweet odor like over-baked bread. "Can you taste it?" Reggie asked. A taste was there, sharp and bitter at the front of the tongue, hard and stale at the back of the mouth, cold like a bad chill wind that made the teeth ache. Jack yelped with fright as Reggie leaped down into the nearest hole and stood there regarding him. "It's stronger down here. Can't you feel it?" Reggie asked. And now Jack could feel it, a dull, sodden feeling that mixed with the taste and the smell. Part of them is here, and part of them isn't. "I don't like this, Reggie," Jack said, not trying to hide the shakiness in his voice. Reggie climbed out of the hole and stood beside him. "This is why the eyes wanted me to come here," he said. His face was lit with purpose and inner fire. "Don't you see? I'm finally going to know what's over that ledge. I'm finally going to know what I have to do. Stay with me," he said, putting his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I can't," Jack said. His skin was crawling with damp, dark feelings. He wanted to run to a place where it wasn't gray and chilly, where the sun didn't look so lifeless, where the clouds were clouds and not looming dark shapes, ready to pounce, where there were no dark holes, no white gates to swing shut and keep you in. From off in the distance, the Calliope's music came drifting to him, and now it soothed him. His skin was alive with feelings, as if things were crawling and sliding all over it. Gray, wet, damp things that wanted to force him to the ground and drag him into the nearest yawning cavity. "Let's go to the amusement park," he said, his voice husky and breathless. "Not yet," Reggie said. "There's light there. Everyone else is there." He looked with a vague longing at the soft, glowing lights beyond the trees. "My mother and sister are there." Reggie grabbed him by the shoulders. "Fight it, Jack. It's the Calliope's music. Fight it like you did before. You were the only one in the whole town to find a way to beat that Calliope, the only one brave enough to fight it, so keep on doing it." "My mother, my sister." "Your mother and sister are dead. They were in the holes in the cemetery 2 days ago. Stay with me, Jack." Reggie held Jack's arm and walked on. They passed through a universe of open graves, up through time, through the great historic mass of Montvale's dead, and still the feelings, the crawling, slippery feelings over Jack's body and brain became stronger. "No more," Jack cried, trying to break free from Reggie's grasp. Reggie held firm, pointing to the mausoleum, the tomb of the unknown man, a dark gray box at the top of the hill. "That's where the eyes want me to go," he said. "That's where I have to go." "Oh God, I'm scared," Jack cried. There were trees close by, as manicured as the lawns and roadway were. The entire world was gray. Close together, the two boys climbed the knoll. Even before they reached the mausoleum, Reggie knew the door would be wide open. It made a dark outline against the grayer sky. "We've got to go in there," Reggie said, drawing his flashlight from his pack. After a moment, shaking, Jack followed suit. The twin beams laced through each other, then settled on the gaping black cavity of the vault's door. "Remember all those nights we sat out here, you and Pup and me, alone in the dark, telling stories?" Reggie asked. "Remember how hard we tried to scare ourselves? It was all phony, and I knew it. We were playing games. All the time we were pretending to be scared. We were laughing because we weren't scared at all. But this is real, Jack." His voice changed, became lower, filled with awe. "Can't you feel it, Jack? Can't you feel what's coming out of that room? It's something you could catch in a box and listen to. It's real. Not lights out with rubber spiders in the dark. That's not the real thing in there. What I've been looking for." He stared at his friend, his eyes wide with wonder. "Can't you feel it, Jack? That's it." Jack felt it, and he froze like a rabbit in a headlight. It would come out and get him. It would hit him on the head and splash his brains all over the pavement in front of the crypt. It would... "I'm going," he said. "Jack, I have to go. Jack, we have to go in there. We have to know." "I don't want to know." Reggie's grip tightened on Jack's arm, trying to pull him through the door into the vault. With each forced step, Jack's terror grew. Suddenly, he lashed out in panic, striking Reggie in the face with the flat of his hand. Reggie held on. Shouting with rage, Jack hit Reggie with his fist. The two boys went down, rolling like wrestlers on the perfect lawn in front of the crypt. Reggie was losing, and then he abruptly rolled on top of his friend and pinned him down by sitting on his chest, his knees pinning down Jack's arms and flailing hands. "Let me go!" Jack screamed, his voice filled with panic. "Jack, listen to me." "Oh God, let me go!" He bucked upward, trying to throw Reggie off. "Listen to me!" Reggie shouted into Jack's face. "No!" Jack screamed back. "Let me go! Let me go!" Jack lurched upward, throwing Reggie to one side. He grabbed at Reggie's arms and pulled them away, hurling Reggie to the ground as he got to his feet. His face was wild. His pack had come undone, spilling its contents halfway out onto the ground. He stood over Reggie for a moment, trying to decide whether or not to jump on him and pummel him. He was crying. He took a few steps backward, his flashlight showing a long, monstrous shadow behind him. "I told you," Jack gasped, "to leave me alone." Reggie made no move, but asked desperately, Please listen. No. Jack was breathing in long, sobbing gasps, looking wildly around as though he expected something to jump out of the shadows. You've been there, Reggie. You know what it's like. I don't. I'm scared. He looked at the soft light of the amusement park over the trees. I want my mother and sister. Reggie got to his feet, but Jack was already a good 20 yards away, looking behind him as he stumbled backward. It seemed as though at any moment he might break into a run. Don't, Reggie pleaded, but Jack said, too late. And then he lurched around and began to run down the winding, perfect pavement toward the front gate. Jack, Reggie shouted, running after him, but it was no use. With long strides, Jack widened the distance between them. At the bottom of the hill, Reggie slowed to a panting halt. Mama, Amy! Jack's plaintive voice reached him, and a chill went up Reggie's back. Something close by shifted, a shadow or the branch of a tree. He spun around to see a looming shape towering above him before it resolved into the trunk of a leafless maple. For a moment he thought he saw two immense eyes, the ones that had left him at the gate of the cemetery. They seemed to fly up and pause over the mausoleum before fading into nothingness. But it was only two faint stars pushing their way through the bright sky of the amusement park. I am with you, the eyes had promised, but now they were gone. A shiver passed over him, and, feeling very alone, he walked back up the hill to stand once more before the cavernous door of the vault. Within, something heavy crashed to the floor. He heard soft, cold laughter nearby through the trees. As though to answer it, the calliope's music grew louder. He did not listen. Whatever it called to, he had already seen. There was another crash, metal against concrete from within the crypt, and the moan of a hurt, despairing animal calling to its maker. Reggie stepped into the darkness. A sudden clamp of dread took a hold of him, but he shook it off and took another step forward. I know you, he said, but even as he said it, that dread overtook him again. His voice sounded weak in the darkness. His resolve had lessened a fraction. A memory, barely hidden in a cloud, was gnawing at him. It formed a small kernel of fear that began to grow. I know you, he repeated, but now his voice sounded like that of a hollow man, and for the first time he was not sure that he knew to whom he spoke. The walls of the tomb were smooth, as he had imagined they would be, only now they dripped with a sticky substance that smelled like blood, like death juice. It pumped out of the walls and onto the floor, a flowing mass drawn from some hidden, failing heart. The pools began to merge, covering the floor and washing toward Reggie in a gently rising wave, pool meeting pool to converge on the spot where he stood rooted. Warm blood ran over his shoes, wetting the bottoms of his jeans, lapping warmly at his ankles. Do you know me? Someone, the eyes, said close by viciously. The kernel of fright sought to explode from within him. He fought it valiantly, forcing it back to seed. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the blood was gone. Hallucination, he thought. After a blinking moment of confusion, he took another step, and something sounded from behind him. He looked back to see the dim shape of a huge and bloated thing lowering itself to the floor in the doorway of the vault. Long, tapering legs, many of them, preceded a fat, bulbous body covered with faintly glistening hair. He could almost hear a puff of expelled breath as the huge spider found the floor and began to scuttle toward him. The hairs on Reggie's body stood on end. With a gigantic effort, he closed his eyes for the briefest moment, remembering the dream he had had where he stood in the trench to warn the soldiers that the monstrous, greasy worm was advancing on them but could not hurt them. It's only a dream! When he opened his eyes, the spider, too, was gone. Bullshit, he thought. All hallucination. He turned to the inner sanctum again. Two heavy, stained glass doors were ajar before him. Over the ledge, he thought. Now I'll know what's over the ledge." "I'm not afraid of you," he said, and this time the fear was gone and he believed himself. He put his hands on the double doors, drawing them back, and suddenly it was there. He was there in the tunnel with the bright, warm light in front of him. He was drifting slowly toward it, toward the figure with two huge eyes. He could almost see the face, could almost feel himself drawn into those eyes when he felt the cold clamp of hands on him from behind, and he looked back to see the other end of the tunnel, filled with the dark shadow close behind him, and there was the grip of cold, spidery hands, and a beginning whisper that was suspended on the edge of time. And this time, no doctor's hands reached in to pull him back to the world. A merciless fear gripped him as the specter spoke. A pure, unsifted terror filled him, sinking into him like cement. "Why don't you help me?" he screamed at the huge eyes, but they only regarded him with unblinking calm. "You said you would be with me." "Kiss me," the dark serpent's whisper came into his ear. Death. Here it was at last. Here was the icy, bleak madness, the skin-ripping coldness of it, the bleached bone, screaming thing itself. Death. Here it was, as thick as molasses. It would reach out at him, an octopus, a thing with grasping hands and claws, with suckers to suck the life from him, to draw him to its breast and squeeze the life from the cells of his body and mind. Here it was, sickly sweet and fetid, damper than mold, wetter than thunderous rains. Death. It gripped and twisted and bit. It pierced him through the middle, searing him with heat and unbearably sharp, burning light. Death. "Kiss me," the shadow breathed with rotted breath, bringing its lips to his. He fell to the floor of the crypt and screamed, throwing his hands over his face. This was what lay beyond that tick of time, the black pit, nothing. The eyes were not here to help him because they could not. You moved toward the light, and then the blackness caught you from behind, crooning into your ear and biting your body in two. Over the ledge there was a dark, deep hole, infinity in length. The thing kissed you, and down you went. A fear quaked through him greater than any he had ever known or imagined. It had all been games, all of it, the dreams and the longing to know what lay just beyond. The warmth of those enormous eyes was a false, suckling heat, a diversion, while the real work went on behind, shooting you in the back. The blackness rose up to encircle him again, to take him finally into its maw, and then suddenly it retreated. He heard a brush of low laughter. "Soon," the voice said, "soon." And he felt the presence, the dark man, move away. He heard an outrush of air and then silence. Shakily, he looked up to see the two eyes, the eyes as large as plates, animals' eyes, the eyes of the betrayer, regarding him placidly from the corner of the room. "I am with you." "Liar!" he screamed, throwing himself forward. He would squeeze those eyes to pools of jelly if he could, but they only moved calmly away from him, hovering like two enormous stars in his heaven. And then he heard the soft calliope music calling to him, and he knew that whatever immunity he had possessed, whatever privilege these evil eyes had graced him with, was gone. Come to me," the calliope called. He heard the soft, calling whine of an airplane passing overhead, felt the soft, insistent pull, the promise of a long-delayed reunion. The eyes were gone. He rose unsteadily to his feet and looked into the open casket of the unknown man. It was smooth and clean, an empty bronze box. He felt as cold and empty as the casket. Where there had been hope, there was now only dread. It wanted him, and he had to go to it. He thought of his mother and of Jack and of Pup and everyone else in Montvale, caught in that bright amusement trap, that thing with claws and tinny music and teeth. It didn't matter anymore, and he must go to it. He walked out of the mausoleum, leaving the stained glass doors ajar, and there it rose before him, the glow of its neons and glass white bulbs, turning the night into a hard outline of low tents, booths, and rides. He stared at that simple, hideous skyline, and suddenly he recognized it. Slowly, his hand went back into his pocket, and he took his wallet out, drew from it a single carefully folded sheet, and opened it, smoothing the creases. He held it up, comparing it with the outline that dominated Montvale. In the center was the Ferris wheel, corresponding to the black citadel on fire, to the right where, in the picture, there was a huge open-mouthed coffin into which peasants were being forced by a phalanx of skeletons, stood the House of Fun. To the far left stood the House of Mirrors in place of the crumbling, tree-topped castle with 2 bell-ringing corpses. There was even a bell, a monstrosity with a long, heavy clapper hanging out of it like a dog's tongue at the summit of the House of Mirrors. In the background were other, less distinct structures, all roughly corresponding to scenes in Bruehl's ghastly painting. To the right in the picture stood a gallows, and through the bright lights Reggie thought he saw a vague outline of some such thing poking up beyond the shadow of a tent. And in the far background, partly visible through a whirling ride and a length of arcade games, was the carousel. From this distance, Reggie could barely make it out, but enough was revealed to him to see that it was turning lazily. He heard a faint call, a cry. The triumph of death. Come to me, come to me. He began to make his way down the far side of the hill toward the bright lights in the distance. There was a great fear in him, but it was strangely muted by the rocking lullaby of the steam whistle. The paper dropped from his hands, skittering off over the perfectly cut blades of grass to settle between the crook of a manicured bush and the wall of the mausoleum. It fluttered a few times, and then the breeze died, letting it settle quietly to the ground. Well, 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 it looks like our hero Reggie is heading for the amusement park. Now it seems it's time for him to come face to face with the truth. One step closer to taking on Ash. One step closer to figuring on what's going on with the town. I'm kind of curious, since he's lost this immunity that he had. Why? Is it because he once again had a brush with death and they kind of needed to pull that little piece from him for him to be able to kind of face off against Ash? What could it be? Is he gonna find zombies down there at the amusement park? I'm curious. I guess we'll find out next time on Secondhand Horror. Until then, stay spooky, my friends. Bye-bye.